My grandparents were Jews from Baghdad who left in 1946 and came to the United States. And so their stories as exiles, as people who were proud to be Iraqi and were Arab Jews and were part of the fabric of this city before the unrest and the suspicions arose in the Middle East in the 1940s, were, very much at the heart of my upbringing. Those stories ended up creating a kind of intangible understanding for something that I belonged to that was far away, that maybe one day I'd be able to retrieve. And once the first Gulf War happened in 1991, it became clear that that was going to become somewhat irretrievable, because the first introduction that I had to Iraq, beyond my grandparents' beautiful stories about the city, were these very violent green-tinted images of night vision that were on CNN and in real time of pictures of Baghdad, but these were pictures of pieces of architecture being indiscriminately blown up. I often tell that story in relation to Enemy Kitchen, which is this ongoing collaboration with my mother that we began in 2003. She, in an effort to kind of, get me to stop seeing those violent images, turned to me and said, there's no Iraqi restaurants in New York, which was this beautiful riddle, because it maybe meant that my mother wanted to open up a restaurant, but then it was also about the lack of visibility of anything from Iraq, in this country, in the United States, beyond oil and war. And for me, this is also one of the reasons why there's a focus now on, the human cultural patrimony. Some of the first examples of writing coming from this museum that was ransacked. And it becomes like the first moment of pathos that opens up in the Iraq War. Because it didn't matter what side you were on, whether you were for the war or against the war. This wasn't just a local Iraqi disaster. This was a disaster for all of humanity. And I also think it was one of those moments when it was a missed opportunity, where the outrage for missing objects did not translate into an outrage for missing bodies. So the project does have its angry side, which is part of what keeps it going, but it's also, a formal commitment to reconstruct everything if it's possible, but it also sets itself up as an impossible project. And I think for me that if we think about other projects of mine, like Parasite, which are these custom-built inflatable shelters that I've designed for the homeless since 1997, the shelters attached to the ventilation ducts on buildings, so the warm air leaving the building through the HVAC system simultaneously inflates and heats this double membrane structure. There's a not so invisible line that connects them. And that project actually began in graduate school when I was in an architecture program at MIT, but also an artist. And it came out of studies that I had done in Jordan of Bedouin tents. And that was already a compromise, because I had wanted to study the architecture of Palestinian refugee camps. I had seen the facade of a building that was made out of just ramshackle parts of cardboard and aluminum siding, and it was made by a family whose house had just been bulldozed by the Israelis. So they reconstructed that facade using whatever was available to them. So this protest architecture, this opposition architecture, this refusal architecture was something I was very interested in. And so when I was looking at the Bedouins encampments, the wind was what they abided by to set up the shelters. And when I came back to the States and I saw these urban nomads, these urban Bedouin who are nomadic by consequence and not by tradition, setting up camps underneath vents just to keep them warm, this was another kind of wind. And I realized that these histories of dispossession are not just far away, but they're also happening in my own city. So it became a way to deal with this on a way that went beyond labeling it by nation states, and it was also a material of urgency the same way these are using detritus and discards. It's interesting to think about this project in relationship to like the larger arguments and discussions about cultural patrimony and where things have ended up. Like the project that we're looking at right now begins in 575 BC with the Ishtar Gate in Babylon, and the construction of that gate by Nebuchadnezzar to be like one of the main magnificent features of the city. And that, of course, gets excavated in the early part of the 20th century by a German archaeologist named Robert Koldewey. And it ends up in the Pergamon Museum, which also houses the Pergamon altar. These are objects that have been, the countries of origin have called for their return. And there's a large debate that goes on about this and about the value of the Imperial Museum. But for me, it's very simple. When things are taken without permission, or if things are taken under questionable circumstances where it's almost like backroom deals are made, this is a problem. The project was meant to kind of mirror some of this. What got me to think about this was the fact that I am working with a gallery in New York that's a commercial gallery. And I'm an artist who works mostly on a project-based practice, and mostly in social and public space, but I also enjoy making objects and drawings. And in 2006, it was possible to go through Chelsea and not know that there was a war going on. And I wanted to find a way of disturbing that. And I looked at the fact that it is an antiquities market that actually made these objects desirable for people who looted for whatever reason, whether it was to fund insurgencies, or it was to pay for one's ticket out of the country, or in the case of Donnie George, he tells a story of this very beautiful little vase that was taken by the people inside the museum because they saw so many things being destroyed, and they kept it for safekeeping until it was safe to bring back. And when I think about the fact that it was the existence of an antiquities market that allowed for it to be looted, I thought, okay, well, I'm an artist who's dealing with a contemporary art market, which is allowing me to show in that gallery. And so why not make an object that essentially haunts these collections as an uncomfortable apparition? You know, to think about our complicity, you know, whether it's conscious or unconscious, of the fact that this is something that we're possibly unwittingly involved in, but for me it's not so unwitting. I know what our culpabilities are, and this is something that I wanted to kind of convey in the work, and also to have that kind of that discomfort mobilized in the work. And so the project has been acquired by several institutions, and one of them is the British Museum, which actually took these replicas of looted artifacts from 2003 and put them next to Mesopotamian artifacts that they had gotten under, you know, questionable circumstances. And the same thing will happen hopefully in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which has acquired about 9 of them. So I appreciate, like, when museums are able to kind of be self-reflective and even critical in looking at its immense inventory and looking at the provenance and also the acquisition history of some of these things, and to allow for those more uncomfortable stories to emerge. One of the things that was very interesting that Dr. George told me was there were many Iraqis living in London who had called for these objects in room 56 in the British Museum to be returned to Iraq. And then in the immediate aftermath of the looting, he told me that he heard from a group of Iraqis that had gone back after the looting to make sure that those objects were still there. And suddenly their attitude changed, where they regarded those artifacts as being fellow refugees and exiles just like them.